start by saying how absolutely delighted I am to be here today. Over the last 12 months or so, I've given about 15 Zoom talks, and it's just not the same. It's really lovely to be in front of a live audience, and I really want to engage with you. So please feel free as I go along to ask any questions, and even better, share any memories that you might have of the Jewish hotels of Bournemouth. Over the next 3/4 of an hour, I'm going to start by talking about the very first ever Jewish holiday makers that came to Bournemouth and where they stayed. Go on to talk about the coming of the first Jewish hotels and the golden years when the hotels were in their heyday in the post-war years. Then talk about the decline of the hotels and the reasons for it. And then the 3 different aspects of hotel life: the food, religion and entertainment. And then perhaps the best bit of all, I'm going to talk and share with you about some of the glorious stories which are included in the book. For the book I interviewed about 150 people, both Jews and non-Jews from across the community, staff, people that owned the hotels and so on. And they just told me some really lovely anecdotes which I must share with you. Please, as I say, butt in. I just love questions. And at the end of the session, I brought lots of books with me, and I'm here to sign them. Okay, starting from the very beginning, the first ever Jewish holidaymakers I've traced back to the late 1870s, the very first people that came along. And they were 2 types of people. They were some quite wealthy people who came to Bournemouth for what they called the season. They came for big chunks of the summer, and they usually had their own houses here, what we'd now call second homes. But by far the majority of the first holiday makers had come to Bournemouth for health reasons, largely convalescence or to recuperate from ill health. Because of that, sadly, quite a few of them died. And some of the reasons for coming were really quite amusing. I found a lovely reference in the Jewish Chronicle during the 1880s to a man who'd come to Bournemouth, quote, to recover from the effects of vexation. What a good reason to come to Bournemouth. When these people first came to Bournemouth, there were no Jewish hotels, there were no kosher establishment, and people therefore stayed in what were then called boarding houses, where some people with some understanding of Jewish customs and requirements made arrangements for Jews. But it's quite clear from press cuttings that Jewish people were not totally comfortable with these arrangements, and quite soon, by the 1890s, we saw the first kosher establishments beginning to appear. The very first ever Jewish establishment was a little house called a Lundy, which opened in 1992. It was run by the Reverend Chotson, who was a retired rabbi from the Belfast community. But very hot on its heels came a place called Maryvale Hall. Now, Maryvale Hall is very interesting because it really was the precursor of what was to come down the line some years later. It was a very big house that had formerly been somebody's home. It stood in its own grounds, nestling amongst the pines, and unlike early establishments, it was on the east cliff rather than the west cliff. About Maryvale Hall, so it was there on the east cliff, which was really a big departure. The arrival of these first establishments stimulated the opening of yet more, mainly boarding houses, nothing larger than that. This slide here shows the 2 places that I've just mentioned. On the left-hand side is a Lundy, the very first ever Jewish establishment, and then Maryvale Hall, as I described, nestling in the Pines. It was in Mayrick Road, for those of you that know your Bournemouth. Turning now to the early 20th century, this is when the Jewish holiday trade really began to take off. There was a real kind of flurry of new establishments in the early years of the 20th century. And what is interesting about this new wave is that they were rebranded. Whereas they'd previously been called boarding houses, they were now called guest houses. And that was quite significant. What the new terminology meant was that there was now much greater emphasis on the comfort and the facilities provided by these establishments. That it wasn't just about bed and board any longer, it was about a much wider experience for the guests. The fact that they were beginning to take off in Bournemouth, and Bournemouth was becoming regarded as a destination for Jewish people, attracted both hoteliers and Jewish guests from other resorts. Well into the 19th century, Jews had started to go to lots of other resorts up and down the country around the coast, but now you could see the move, the recognition that Bournemouth was perhaps the way forward for holidays for Jewish people. There was a particularly accelerated rapid development of Jewish establishments in the years immediately after the First World War. The growth came from two quarters, whereas in the past a lot of the people who'd come to Bournemouth for holidays had been convalescents, and that was kind of what people saw Bournemouth as. Now there were two types of holidaymakers. On the one hand, there were Jews who still lived in the very crowded first areas of settlement, mainly in London and the other big urban centres. So they were really trying to get away from the kind of overcrowding in those areas. And this is kind of seen in the adverts for the establishments which they stayed. So, for example, there was a lot of discussion of airy accommodation, of lofty rooms, etc. That was the emphasis for this group of people. The other group of Jewish people were the more upwardly mobile. People that had made it out of the first areas of settlement were now living alongside non-Jewish people and really wanted to be part of mainstream environment. They too wanted to have their holidays like non-Jewish people. Because of the demand for these more upwardly mobile people, this led to the very first Jewish establishments which called themselves hotels rather than guest houses. And the very first establishments that called themselves hotel were Baraha, which is actually a lovely name for a Jewish hotel because it's Hebrew for blessing. The Trouville and Eastcliff Court. Now just hang on to Eastcliff Court because the arrival of Eastcliff Court was very significant indeed. There was intense competition between these new establishments. They vied for attention. In their adverts in the Jewish Chronicle, they were just full of superlatives. The biggest, the best, the most commodious accommodation, the most extravagant in Europe, etc. It just made me laugh. And they were constantly closing so that they could extend and install new facilities. There was a great kind of competition, particularly at this time, in forms of entertainment. They all had glorious ballrooms which were open to local people. During the 1930s, we really see the setting of the stage for what was to come after the Second World War, when three other Jewish hotels opened. They were Eastcliff Manor, the Ambassador, which has it was very, very pertinent because it was the first ever purpose-built Jewish hotel anywhere, and the Green Park, which opened in the middle of war. Okay, let me move on then. So some of the hotels that I've been talking about On the top left there is the Trouville, which was in Priory Road, Maryvale, which is in Kersley Road, and Eastcliff Court, which was in Manor Road, I believe. And also those 3 new hotels, Eastcliff Manor, the Green Park, and the Ambassador. Let's talk about the Big 8. During the Second World War, there was a bit of a hiatus in the development of the Jewish holiday trade. A lot of the hotels, including several of the Jewish hotels, were requisitioned for the war effort. They were taken over by a lot of the American troops, or, for example, in the example of Eastcliff Manor, it was used to accommodate evacuees from other places. Very quickly after the war, the 4 other hotels were joined by the Normandy, the Langham, the Majestic, and the Cumberland, and they came to be known as the Big 8. These were the hotels which dominated the holiday scene in Anglo Jewry for the next 30 years. They were the nexus of Jewish holiday making. They were very glitzy and were often compared to the Catskills in America, which people may know about, and they rather outshone a lot of the non-Jewish accommodation in Bournemouth. So here are the 4 that joined the original hotels. So you've got the Cumberland in the top left, the Langham in the top right, and the Majestic and the Normandy on the bottom of the page. And people may be aware that the Normandy, perhaps a shadow of its former self, is still here in Bournemouth today. And some of the others are here, but not as Jewish hotels. Let's talk about what it was like to stay in one of these hotels when they were in their heyday. The clientele. People came from far and wide to stay in these big hotels. I was talking to Gerald, isn't it, here? And some people came as far afield as Scotland to stay in these hotels, often travelling overnight to be here. Amongst the people who stayed were some very rich and some quite famous people in Anglo Jewry, but actually they were very egalitarian. If you were able to afford to stay in one of these hotels, there was no discrimination about where you were in life. You were welcome. The hoteliers treated everybody as if they were royalty, regardless of their station in life. The young people who stayed in the hotels had a ball. They really loved being there. They made friends. They particularly loved being in the hotels at night. There are lots of tales of groups of young people moving from one hotel to another, sampling the entertainment that was on offer. They loved it so much that they came back, first of all, for their honeymoons, and then they brought their families with them once they'd married. The patterns of people coming to Bournemouth are really interesting because people tended to come back at the same time every year. They stayed in the same hotel. They stayed, if they could, in the same room, and they sat at the same dining table if they could make that possible. There was a real regularity, and also there was something quite tribal about the patterns of holiday making, in that people from different parts of the country established themselves in different hotels. So, for example, for some reason, a lot of people from Manchester favoured the Normandy, while people from Hull and Midlands liked the Majestic. Don't know why. The hotels were extraordinarily glamorous. They were very show affairs, and there were lots of tales of daily fashion parades, both within the hotels themselves and also people who paraded on the walkways outside the hotels, showing off their gowns. They were called gowns in those days, their jewellery and their furs. And even better, stories of people who sent down in advance of their stays vans of their clothes that they were going to wear, their shoes that they were going to wear. I'm told that they catered for at least 3 different changes of clothes a day. The hoteliers. In large, these hotels were owned and run by Jewish families. They were very had a high profile in the running of the hotel, very hands-on, and they gave the hotels a very family feel. It was as if you were coming to a house party rather than staying in a hotel. But what I just loved about the hoteliers were the stories of the people who I came to call the Grand Dame of Bournemouth. A lot of the hotels were run by very powerful women who were really dominated the scene. Faye Schneider at the Majestic, Faye Guild at the Langham, and the Felds at the Cumberland, and so on. Interestingly, the majority of staff at the hotels were mainly non-Jewish, and the reasons for that are largely religious, in that Jews were not able to work or to operate machinery on the Jewish Sabbath, but to keep the hotels going, there needed to be staff there. However, the non-Jewish staff were highly valued, very well paid and very well trained, and as a result they were very loyal to the hotels. In putting together my book, I actually interviewed a large number of people who had worked at the hotels, and it was lovely hearing their stories. I want to talk about not just the big hotels, the big 8, which everybody has on the tip of their tongue when they talk about Jewish holiday trade in Bournemouth, but also the guest houses and the smaller hotels, which are often overlooked. There was a great variety of these smaller establishments, ranging from quite large hotels down to people that just offered the odd bedroom for bed and breakfast during the summer season. They were dotted all over Bournemouth. Some of them came and went quite quickly, but some endured quite a few years as well. Over this period of the heyday, we can see these smaller establishments becoming more comfortable and larger as people's aspirations grew. I was quite delighted to learn that the people who ran these smaller establishments were actually very close to each other. There was quite a coherent network of owners and managers who knew each other well and actually supported each other in the running of the establishments. There was quite a good barter system going. I'll swap you my coconut pyramids for your latkes, a type of bartering system. And compared to the larger establishment, they were very much more integrated in the local community, and the general pattern was with the wives ran the establishments whilst the men had jobs or owned businesses elsewhere in Bournemouth, and because of that they were very much part of the local community. Many of them were run by very interesting characters, ranging from a family called the Gutsteins, who ran the Carmel Hotel, which was a very, very orthodox establishment well before Bournemouth became a lot more orthodox, through to people like Mr. Rivlin, who ran the Grosvenor Hotel, which had a bit of a reputation for being a gambling den. Some of the owners were Holocaust survivors and had very interesting backgrounds, some of them quite poignant. I can't leave this slide about the mention of the guest houses without mention of some of the other holiday establishments. I don't know if people are aware that at one time there were 3 homes in Bournemouth, Jewish homes: Branksome Dean, which is a convalescent home, Dolly Russ, which was a home for blind people, and Carlton Dean, which was a home for people with disabilities. And each of them, in addition to having residents, were open to holidays as well. And they were very much part of the Jewish offering in the area. Again, pause for any questions, any memories, before I move on.
I can give you quite a few memories if you want.
Yeah, can I take one from Helander first? No?
My parents ran a Jewish holiday school during the summer.
Yes.
Years and years ago, in the 60s. And my grandfather didn't want to have anything to do with it, so they used to bring him down to Branksome Dean for respite care. And he wasn't an invalid, but he wanted to stay somewhere Jewish, so I have memories of that place.
Yeah. So it had its own synagogue, and it was quite kosher. It had a kosher kitchen, etc., didn't it? Yes.
Was it just word of mouth that got ball rolling as such? How one hotel, 2 hotels became, as you say, 8?
It was a lot of word of mouth. The Jewish community is quite small compared to communities in other countries, and people are connected within it, and that word very quickly moves around the Jewish community. And actually, it's a well kind of recognised Jewish phenomenon that where one Jew goes, a lot pile in behind, and that's certainly happened in the case of Bournemouth. And I think it was facilitated by the high profile that the Jewish hotels had in the Jewish press. If you have a look back through past copies of the Jewish Chronicle, there were huge adverts for these hotels, and they got a lot of editorial coverage as well. Memories. Sorry, Geraldine.
You're speaking of an era when families used to go together with their children, and one of the big attractions was, in my case, coming from Scotland, being able to meet other Jewish people who had come from Manchester or Birmingham or London or elsewhere. And in a way, it was also a little bit of a marriage market.
Good to talk about that.
Oh, right, we're coming to that. Okay, I won't say anymore. I actually have stayed in every single one of the hotels that's been mentioned, apart from the First World War, because I'm not that old. But certainly I've been in every one of the ones post-war, and at one time or the other. And also my family were friendly with 3 of the main owners of the Ambassador, the Cumberland, and the Majestic. So it was almost a family occasion to come down. Nobody went abroad. There was no aircraft flying at a cost that most people could afford anyway. And commercial flying didn't start until several years after the war. So you were indeed enjoying the staycation, which was returned for another unfortunate reason, as we know. I'll shut up because I don't know what to say.
You're actually leading very nicely into my next slide, but there's another question about that.
Jewish synagogues, did they grow up with the hotels, or were they here before
That's a really, really pertinent question. So by the turn of the 20th century, there were about 10 families who lived permanently in Bournemouth. And that was a critical mass enough to start the ball rolling in terms of setting up the First Synagogue. And Bournemouth Hebrew Congregation opened formally as a community in 1905 and the synagogue itself in 1911. And what you saw there was actually a symbiotic relationship between the synagogue and the holiday trade. The opening of the community actually attracted holidaymakers because there was somewhere that they could worship, and because the community was able to ensure a continuous supply of kosher meat and other kosher products. But then likewise, the increasing number of Jews coming to the area swelled the ranks of the community and actually encouraged some people to stay in the area. So there was a kind of two-way process between the synagogue and the holiday trade. So good question, thank you. I think the year was 1947 that formally got going. It was much later than the more orthodox community. Yeah.
Can't make go past the slide without mentioning Hannah Levy's house.
Yes, Hannah Levy.
Closed in January.
Yes, I know, I did, yes. And that's mentioned throughout the book, particularly in relation to the amount of support that the local hoteliers, the Jewish hoteliers, gave to Hannah Levy. A lot of them hosted meetings and charitable events to raise money for Hannah Levy. A lot of the hoteliers actually sat on the committee that supported Hannah Levy House locally. And the synagogues, yeah. Okay, shall I move on? Joe, thank you for the prompt. I'm going to talk about the decline of the holiday trade now. Come the 1960s, there was very quickly a discernible decline in the uptake of the places in the hotels. Part of this was the change in holiday patterns generally, the coming of cheap air travel, particularly package holidays. Like everybody else, not just Jewish people, Jews actually began to see the benefits of going abroad for their holidays. It became attractive to play kaluki in the sun rather than on the beach in Bournemouth. There was also a general change in lifestyles. The new generation were not so attracted by the old formula of staying in a hotel at the same time each year, participating in the sorts of activities that their parents had. There's a beginning of a kind of desire for different types of holiday. They didn't forsake Bournemouth altogether. Younger people started to come for what we now call short breaks rather than for their main holiday, but they did really get attracted to going elsewhere. However, I want to stress that there were also some quite specific Jewish reasons for the decline in the hotels and the guest houses. Some of that was about the role of Israel. After the Six-Day War, there was a great upsurge in support and feeling for Israel, and a quite kind of strong feeling that that's where people wanted to be, perhaps rather than Bournemouth. So a lot of people went to Israel rather than Bournemouth. There was a big surge in the cost of providing kosher facilities. Regulations around kosher food were now much more stringent than they used to be, and this made it quite difficult for the Jewish establishments to compete with the non-Jewish establishment. There was a polarisation much more pronounced in Anglo Jewry, whereas in the past people were pretty much all middle of the road in their outlook on Judaism. But now there were people who were more progressive and people who were more orthodox, and actually they wanted something different from the middle of the road provision that the hotels had provided. The guest houses were the first to disappear. They were unable to provide the kind of facilities that people wanted. They were regarded as a bit unfashionable, so they began to close first. A lot of them became care homes or small black blocks of flats, but their decline was very quick. However, their decline was soon followed by the hotels as well. As early as the 1960s, the Big Eight began to close. Both the Eastcliff Manor and Eastcliff Court closed in 1960, very quickly followed by the Langham and the Majestic, and then the Cumberland and the Green Park, leaving only the Normandy and the Ambassador, or New Ambassador as it was by then. And they offered very different types of accommodation. The New Ambassador was very much about kind of keeping the tradition of the hotels in their heyday going. People still had a taste for that traditional Jewish atmosphere, traditional Jewish food. That's what it was about. Whereas the Normandy became very orthodox indeed. It changed ownership and, as we would say in Jewish terms, it became very frum and attracted a very different audience. However, alongside that decline, there was a very rapid growth in self-catering accommodation for Jewish people. A lot of people who used to holiday in the hotels had really sort of fallen in love with Bournemouth and decided that they still wanted to come back, and they either started to rent or to even own their own property. And actually that was the shape of things to come, and actually what we have in Bournemouth today in terms of Jewish holiday patterns. A lot of Jews who come to this day stay in rented or they're in own accommodation. There are 2 Jewish hotels which are still here. The Normandy, which is very orthodox still, and the Water Garden, people know it in Annerley Road, but again, very orthodox. The people who make up the bulk of the holiday makers are people who, in Jewish terminology, we call the Haredi community, the Orthodox, and they are quite visible. People may have seen the Haredi Jewish holiday makers on the streets, particularly in the summer when they come for a long time and bring their families to stay in the area. And the area around Manor Road in particular is now dubbed Stamford Hill on Sea. There are a lot of kind of facilities for the Haredi community there. Okay, very quickly, and I realise that I'm not going to do this justice. There are 2 parts to my book. The first is the chronological development of the hotels and guest houses, and then there are a series of chapters about different aspects of hotel life, the food and the eating, the entertainment and leisure pursuits, and religion. In the time, I just cannot talk enough about those. I just want to flag them up. Each one of those areas is worth a talk on its own, particularly the food and eating, which is actually the biggest chapter in the book because it's so central to Jewish life. The big Jewish hotels in particular were known for their lavish catering arrangements. I heard it described as a 24/7 eatathon. People lurched from one meal to another, and those meals were huge, and the portions were huge as well. And the people they became known for the food. Particularly famous were what were known as the Shabbat Kiddushim, and I'll explain that. It is tradition after the services on the Jewish Sabbath to have some food and wine. The hotels took this to excess. they became known for the weight of these kiddushim. The tables groaned under the amount of food there was, and all of this before a 4-course lunch. It didn't stop people eating. Entertainment and pursuits. I don't know if people were aware that at one stage the Jewish hotels were extraordinarily well known for their star-studded entertainment. They had cabarets which attracted the biggest names in the country, both Jewish and non-Jewish. And a lot of people actually started their careers performing at a Jewish hotel in Bournemouth. A lot of people went on to the London scene, having performed here in Bournemouth. However, alongside these star-studded entertainment were some quite traditional Jewish pursuits, particularly card playing. You weren't anybody in a Jewish hotel if you didn't play cards, particularly kaluki. There was also quite a gambling culture at one stage, some of which was conducted behind closed doors, but it was nevertheless quite apparent. And also dancing. It was a big thing in the Jewish hotels. Religion, the Jewish religion, was an integral part of hotel life. Some hotels were more orthodox than others. For example, the Green Park was known to be a lot more orthodox than some of the other hotels. They had each of them, the big hotels, not the small ones, religious supervisors, what we call shomer, who regulated the Jewish life within the hotels, and some of them got to be very well-known names, and there was quite a lot of competition to get these shomer roles in the Jewish hotels. It was seen to be a kind of prime role to get to be a shomer in a Jewish hotel in Bournemouth. And although people were quite respectful of Jewish customs and practices within the hotel, there were quite a few tales of some rule breaking, but it was quite discreet. Before I move on to talk about some of the stories, again, any comments, thoughts? Right, there are two things. You can get them in the two Jewish hotels, and the Water Garden actually has an attached delicatessen, which does a full range of Jewish food, and the Bournemouth Hebrew congregation also has a small kosher shop as well, which is open on a Friday, and you can pre-order. So a lot of people who come down for weekends or short vacations actually order in advance and can pick up their kosher food there. But as you say, all of the local supermarkets as well cater for kosher. It just reminds me of a funny story. Somebody I spoke to told me about why people from Israel come to Bournemouth, and his story was that his daughter comes on a regular basis because she can buy chocolate buttons in Asda. I thought it was lovely. Any more questions? No. Okay, let's do some stories. This is the fun bit. And I'd like to introduce my husband, Michael Hart, who has kindly agreed to be my narrator. So what I'm going to do is explain a little bit about the stories, and Michael is going to tell them for me. So I just talked about the kiddushim, those meals before lunch, and how prominent they were. And here is a story told to me by somebody I interviewed called Hetty Marks.
So many people crowded round the kiddush, it's sometimes difficult to get to the food. Once we were staying at the Majestic, my husband managed to squeeze his way in to try and procure a fish cake for me. Just as he was putting his hand towards the plate, an arm reached across him and almost speared him. He escaped injury, but after that he stood well back until those hungrier than him had taken what they wanted.
What I learnt as I interviewed people was just how many things can go wrong in the running of a hotel. And there were stories galore about some of the escapades and some of the things which went awry. And this next story, and I have it on good authority that every word is true, is an illustration. It's quite a long one, but it's worth listening to.
This is as bad as 40 Towers, I think. I remember once when Mimo was on holiday and Mario and I were left in charge. A customer came up to me and said, "Nino, I'm coming in September. I want a birthday cake, but please don't wait for us to finish dinner. Bring the cake as soon as we sit down and give our order." So I went to the pastry chef, told him I needed the birthday cake for 6 people for September. On the day of the birthday, the restaurant was full. I said to Mario, "Go and get the cake straight away." He went off, but he didn't come back. I went to see what was happening, which I shouldn't have done because I was in charge. I found Mario in the patisserie. He said, "I can't find the cake. It's nowhere to be seen." I said to myself, "God, what do I do now?" I went into the kitchen where the Polish chef Nicky was working. He wasn't too bad with cakes. I told him, "Nicky, drop everything. You're going to make a cake." I left him to it and I returned to the restaurant. Time passed, but the cake didn't arrive. I went back to the kitchen to find out what was happening. Nicky told me he didn't know how to write "Happy Birthday." So I showed him how to melt chocolate and use the icing tube to write "Happy Birthday." But he forgot the H and wrote "Happy Birthday." With a palette knife, I removed the lettering and I spread on another layer of buttercream. I wrote "Happy Birthday" on a piece of paper for him to follow. Back in the restaurant, people were starting to leave. Still the cake didn't arrive. I went back to the kitchen once more to see if the cake was ready, which it was. Mario picked it up, opened the door, and dropped the cake on the floor. I was now sweating with panic. We put the cake back together and took it to the restaurant. The band was having a break. The room was deserted apart from the table of 6 people waiting for the cake. The guest who'd ordered the cake looked at it and he said, "Looks like it's been on the floor." I said, "How did you guess?" He laughed. Otherwise he would have killed me.
It's just fabulous, isn't it? In the decade after the Second World War, the food served in the smallest guest houses was on the homely side, and they really had trouble with the rationing to provide the sort of meals that were available in the larger hotels. And a friend of mine called Diana Langan rang me and told me this story about the smaller guest houses.
My parents went to Bournemouth on honeymoon in 1946. They stayed in one of the guest houses there. My father was deaf, but one of his great pleasures in life was eating. The food in the accommodation was awful. He decided they couldn't stay there any longer. My parents went upstairs. My father asked to borrow my mother's lipstick. He used it to paint spots on his face and neck. He went back downstairs to explain to the owner they had to leave because he wasn't well. Seeing the spots, the owner was only too pleased to let them go. So they packed their bags and they moved to the Green Park. The following night, they went down to dinner in the dining room. While they were eating, to their horror, they noticed that the guest house owner was also dining there. They were quite embarrassed, but it was clear the guest house owner didn't like his own food.
The people who stayed in the Jewish hotels during the Jewish festivals and holy days tended to be the more religious Jews and also wealthy, because it was quite expensive to stay in the hotels at that time. But there were some exceptions to that pattern. And Barbara Glynn, who is actually the daughter of the Marriotts who once owned the Green Park, told me this story. No,
Oh, okay.
Auntie Ray.
One lady phoned up and spoke to my Auntie Ray. She liked coming for the first 2 weeks in June. Auntie Ray pointed out that this year the festival of Shavuos would fall within the period she usually came. And knowing the lady wouldn't want to be there for the festival and pay the extra cost involved, she suggested that she might choose another time. After a prolonged argument, my aunt said rather sarcastically, "Perhaps you'd like to phone the chief rabbi, ask him to move the festival date." The customer replied, "Oh, would you?"
I talked about these very powerful women who ran some of the hotels, and particularly prominent was Faye Schneider, who owned the Majestic Hotel. And her daughter, Shirley Davidson, told me this story.
My mother once went to visit the Catskill hotels in America to see how they operated. The man who was giving a guided tour of one of the hotels knew who she was and kept saying to her things like, "We have 3 pools. I don't suppose you do." And "We can seat over 1,000 people in our dining room. How many do you seat?" So when he said, "I don't suppose you have anything like this," she got fed up and said, "Oh yes we do. It's called Butlins."
And very last story. I mentioned in my presentation about how well trained the non-Jewish staff were working in the hotels. And this is an illustration of that.
The Reverend Samuel Wolfson, who was the religious supervisor of the Green Park Hotel, Bournemouth, where the crockery and kitchen utensils are marked in red or blue for milk and meat separation, was talking to one of the directors in the hotel lounge when water suddenly poured down from the ceiling from an overflowing bath. Mr. Wolfson told a porter to bring some bowls from the kitchen to catch the water. The man came back empty-handed and said, "Kitchen wants to know, sir, do you want red bowls or blue bowls?"
So there's the stories, and end of my presentation. The floor is yours. Questions, comments, memories. Stunned you to silence. No.
There's a story I've heard, and I like it very much. I think it's quite funny. In the winter, obviously, heating came on the top, in that term. And obviously, the Jewish people can't throw the switch, so they have Gentile people to do that. But all of a sudden, something happened like a woolly day when the heating went off, and there was nobody around of Gentile ilk to do any switching. So the manager decided you can't let them all freeze, that would lose guests. So he threw the switch, but he was Jewish. So apparently it all got to the point of being almost going to court about what he'd done. And he actually lost his job.
It's true.
And it's true.
It's mentioned in the book.
I think it's the sort of thing, Gentiles really smile about.
Yes. Yes, it's true.
Was that it?
indeed, because there was something that happened there
Yes.
to do with looking the electric light on. Yes, got to the echoes.
Oh, did it?
But it didn't show it in a very good light. Something. If you don't understand the noise and reactions.
I think it was a sign of the times, the trend I talked about, the hotels becoming much more orthodox than they had been earlier.
I can read to you about the 1960 change of type of holiday. My parents had a guest house in Brighton, and they had it from 50 to 60, and which was fine. But then we had 4 bad summers, rain in a row, going up to 1960, and everyone decided to go off to Spain, southern cheap holidays. And the guest house was totally deserted. They had to close.
Yes.
Nobody wanted to come to do a staycation.
It happened very quickly, with the small establishments that just... Okay, thank you for listening. And I have got copies of the book, and if you'd like the book signed, that's what I'm here for. Thank you.